everyone, welcome to the Sanskaari Girls Podcast. My name is Kuhoo, and today we are talking about wanting, one of the most fundamental human experiences and one of the most policed. I'm joined by Professor Madhavi Menon, who teaches English literature at Ashoka University and directs the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality there. She's the author of several books, including Infinite Variety, A History of Desire in India, The Law of Desire, Shakespeare, a queer companion to the complete works of Shakespeare, which is a personal favorite of mine, and an upcoming one tentatively titled Love in the Moonlight, Sufism, Sexuality, and Shakespeare. She spent her career thinking deeply about what it means to desire, to want, and to imagine lives beyond what we're told is possible. Professor Menon, welcome. It's so nice to be able to have this conversation with you today, especially as I've had the chance to study with you before. Thank you so much for joining us with this conversation.
Thank you so much, Kuhu. It's lovely to be here. As you might know, the only reason I said yes to this was because of the title of your organization. It's like anyone who can call themselves a Sanskaari Girls Book Club is something that I certainly want to be associated with.
Thank you so much, Professor Menon. And I do want to start off our conversation with something that you wrote. In the past, you've written, we are always both seeing and not seeing desire around us, especially when that desire steers clear of the form of a heterosexual couple. That simultaneous seeing and not seeing feels so central to how we experience wanting and also what we're hoping to discuss throughout the podcast today. So, can you talk a little bit about what you meant by that?
I'm interested in the fact that you use the word wanting because that's not a term that I generally use, even though I like it. So the terms I use usually are desire and sexuality. So if I use those terms today, it would be, or it should be understood as being fairly synonymous with the idea of wanting in the way in which you are talking about it. So I think actually the thing that comes immediately to mind when you ask me that question about simultaneously seeing and not seeing is, of course, Ismat Chughtai short story Lihaf, in relation to which I think this idea gets really interestingly investigated. So, as many of you might know already, Ismat Chughtai writes this short story and gets prosecuted for it and has to travel to Lahore to defend herself in front of the English court there, the High Court there. And she gets off the hook, she gets exonerated, not because she's able to prove anything, but precisely because her lawyer adopts a really interesting trick. So he asks all the complainants, all the ones who have said this is an obscene short story and we should not have it in circulation because it's going to adversely impact everybody who reads it, it's going to adversely affect everyone who reads it because it's obscene. And so the lawyer goes around to every single one of the people who have made this complaint and said, well, can you point to a single obscene word in the story? And no one is able to do that. And so the lawyer is able to get Ismat Chughtai off the hook. And what's interesting to me about that, as about the story itself, is that they're not able to point to something obscene, even though they all know that it's obscene, because obscenity is precisely that thing that you don't see. In fact, the word obscene itself, obscene, is what's not on the scene. It's off scene, it's off stage. And so for me, that's a very interesting template in which to think about desire, which is that everyone can see it, but no one can say what it is, or no one can tell you what it is. And so the advantage of that, of course, is that you can get away with a variety of things that are actually about desire, but don't necessarily appear to be about desire or sexuality. And I think this is one of the big advantages actually of not naming desire as desire. And so you get away in the crevices and the cracks, in the shadows, in ways that can be deeply pleasurable because no one is looking for you there. So it's almost like a game of hide and seek where you don't want to be found, precisely because the hiding itself is delicious. The hiding itself is where the action is, as it were. And so being able to see and not see at once is not just the condition of obscenity. I think for me, it's the condition of desire itself. It's the condition of what it means to think about sexuality.
Thank you. And I think that sets me up so perfectly for the next question because, like you said, you spent so much time talking about desire and sexuality. And
Yeah.
your book, Infinite Variety, really explores the history of desire in India. And one thing that strikes me is how you also show desire as inherently multiple, not singular. You sort of look at
Yeah.
everything from Khajuraho sculptures to celibate gods, from Sufi dargahs to army barracks. And what does it mean then to think about desire as having these infinite sort of varieties rather than fixed categories?
Yeah, I mean the fascinating thing about desire is that it worms its way into fields and issues and subjects and ideas where you don't think it belongs. And that, in fact, that becomes the entire sort of MO, as it were, of desire, which is that it is always where you least expect to find it. And it is often not where you expect to find it. So, in fact, the institution of marriage is not actually where I would look in order to find desire. But you know, the sort of the metro is a place that I would look in order to find it, or in order to sort of catch glimpses of it. So there's a way in which desire is not to be found where you think it will be, which means that all these arenas that you just mentioned, not just the sort of erotic sculptures or anything like that, but really a wide variety of anything, sort of agricultural fields, policy institutes, you know, military regulations. All these are where you find desire playing a very, very important role. You know, in terms of the military, just sort of recently, you would have heard in the US, President Trump and the sort of chief summoning everybody and saying this is what the army officers should look like. And the men must not have beards and they must not be effeminate and all that stuff. So the idea of desire, the idea of sexuality, the idea of gender, what is a good man or the proper kind of man and woman, affect all these arenas. So the question for me always becomes, where can you hide from in relation to gender? And the fact of the matter is that you can't hide anywhere, because it is everywhere around you, right? So there is a way in which all these aspects that you mentioned, all these realms that you mentioned, are just sort of very few of the many places in which it can be found. And for me, some of the places that I found it in for that book was certainly interesting, right? For the army, for instance, or even, as you remember, I have a chapter on celibacy, which, you know, would seem to be the opposite of desire. And it's going to be, but of course one is desirous of celibacy as well. And what was interesting to me about that chapter on celibacy is that, unless we think about sexuality as being restricted to the act of genital intercourse, and we then say, okay, I'm not having genital intercourse, therefore I'm celibate, that is one thing. But if you're thinking about sexuality as being this vast, widespread arena and network of follicles that appear in different places, then actually celibacy makes no sense. Just like asexuality might make no sense, precisely because asexuality presumes that it's only the act of genital sex that constitutes sex. But if you think of sexuality more broadly, there is no question of being asexual because even in our desire not to have genital sex, we are desirous. So desire becomes one of those things that you really can't escape. And there are modes, of course, many modes in which to address it, respond to it, play with it. But I don't think any of those modes can actually place themselves outside desire. I don't think there is an outside to desire.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting that you talk about finding desire in often places where it is the least expected. And I
Yeah,
know when you talk specifically about marriage, it can, of course, be a provocation that you say that that is perhaps not the place that you are looking for
yeah,
desire.
yeah,
You've written that even if we are married to the same person and
yeah,
remain faithful to her or him for the rest of our lives, that we will not stop our desires from straying. It's a very provocative statement because it
yeah,
really separates desire from action, from even fidelity, for that matter. So, this distinction between what we do and
yeah.
what we want, why do you think it matters?
Well, I mean, the example that you just gave, what I'm trying to do is, provocatively or not, what I'm trying to do is attach desire to fantasy. So, which is to say, and I think that's what I go on to say in later on in that paragraph that you just quoted, which is that even if we think of ourselves as the most faithful, monogamous people in the world, and frankly, a monogamy can be a lot easier than not. Even if we think of ourselves that way, that doesn't stop fantasy from playing a very big role in our lives. And so, for me, as a scholar of desire or as a scholar of sexuality, to discount fantasy in the face of seeming monogamy seems to be foolish. Because you have to, in fact, think about fantasy at all times because we're all always in the grip of it. Whether or not we act on that fantasy is an entirely different thing. And so, yes, I actually think about fantasy as action itself because it allows our desires to travel along roads that we might not travel along physically. It also allows us to think about desire as not relegated to or restricted by the physical alone, that it actually has realms, which is why the movie industry is so big, which is why the cosmetic industry is so big, because we all peddle in fantasy. We all peddle in the fantasy of desire, the desire for fantasy. And so to think about desire independent of fantasy won't take us very far.
Thank you so much. And I also begin to think about, especially when you're making either this distinction or desire almost becoming this tool for fantasy.
Yeah.
I do have also then thoughts about who gets to experience desire, who gets to indulge in fantasy. I know you spoke, for example, about the movie industry, you spoke about the cosmetic industry, and just in relation to that, how everyone is able to access some of these things. I'd love to get into a little bit more also about whose desires sort of count for all of us, right? And I'd love to talk about a specific case. And in 2009, as you know, the Delhi High Court decriminalized homosexuality. And one of the justifications was that constitutional morality should trump social morality. And you've really written about how this has created a hierarchy, which is enlightened law versus a backward society. So, what's problematic about this framing? Why are we, challenging some of this framing as well?
Yeah. I mean, the law is a very, it's a fascinating structure. I'm fascinated by the law. As you know, I've even written about it. I think in another life, I would be a lawyer myself because I love it so much. But I love it precisely because it's quite mad. And I think the minute we start taking it seriously as the truth with a capital T, that's when we get legal systems that are in as much crisis as I think ours are today. It's much easier for someone from the outside looking in because I don't have to take it seriously. I can actually interpret it and analyze it. What's fascinating about the law is that it pretends to be above the thing that it's actually creating. So, for instance, just to go back to our example of marriage, so the idea that law is, it's not interested or invested in particular kinds of sexual orientations, but it will only allow marriage to certain kinds of sexual orientations because that is the basis for a certain kind of social fabric. That is its official position, right? And then people scramble to say, oh, no, no, we want to get married too, we want to get married too. And as you might know, I've written sort of quite outspokenly against this idea of gay marriage. Because for me, the minute everyone scrambles to the right to get married, what you're doing is acceding to the framework that the law has made for you. So instead of actually trying to challenge it and saying, this framework does not make any sense, you're actually saying, oh, if this is the framework, can I join too? Can I belong to the club? And I've always been wary of clubs because they tend to be sort of, old boys clubs, old boys networks. I don't like them. And the reason I'm wary of them in terms of legal paraphernalia is precisely because the minute you accede to the assumptions, you cannot get out of it, right? So if you just think about marriage, the baseline assumption of marriage is that if you get married, A, we will recognize you, and B, we will recognize a whole host of civil rights. So, inheritance, property, ownership, healthcare, all these civil rights will then be associated with the right of marriage. Now, instead of saying, yes, please, I want to get married too, If we were to say, well, these civil rights do not belong to my sexual desire, so it needs to be separated and they should be given to everybody, regardless of what their sexual orientation or desire might be, that for me is a more radical step. So instead of saying, please, please, can I get married too? You have to be able to say the way in which you are policing desire is all wrong. And who I have sex with, or who I want to have sex with, or who I just dream about having sex with but never actually do, should have no bearing on my bank account. So, that for me is the insidious way in which the law defines us. And it's a definition that I've been very uncomfortable with all my life and throughout. So then to go back to the framing of your question, certainly the law encourages heterosexuality and nothing else, right? And so many countries, for instance, will allow civil unions to homosexual couples, but not marriage. Now, what is the difference between that? Why is one the cherry and one the sort of, why is one the heir and the other the spare? Why is one lesser than the other? The law will never deign to explain. But those of us who want to think about it can see very clearly it's because they want to control a certain kind of social reproduction by controlling the sexual reproduction. And because a non heterosexual relationship is not immediately reproductive sexually, it is also not reproductive socially. So, what the law tries to do really is to control the social fabric by trying to control the sexual fabric. And if you think that a non heterosexual relationship can ever get the same status as a heterosexual relationship under law, then that's a mistake we're making. Even in the US now, of course, that entire gay marriage right is very much under threat now, which a heterosexual marriage right would never be, right? Even if the most right wing of president were to come or the right wing of prime ministers were to come, that would never be threatened because that is unshakable. So rather than try and scramble away from our precarity, my idea, my politics has always been to make the most of it, to actually embrace it and say there is a certain kind of politics of the precarious that we need to stick with rather than running wholesale to try and join the mainstream.
And it's so important that you talk about this because in the law of desire, you also examined section 377 and obscenity law. And
Yeah.
you made this fascinating point that these laws are not punishing certain desires, they're actually producing new categories of desires by trying to prohibit them. So, what is that paradox?
Yeah, I mean it's the paradox with which we started today our discussion of Lihaf, right? Which is that the law does not the law certainly says this desire is allowed and that desire is not allowed. But the law has no way of controlling your fantasy. The law has no way of saying this is not allowed in your phantasmatic mind or in your phantasmatic life, which is why the law is always wary of sexuality or needs to police it so inordinately because it can't actually control it. And therein, I think, lies our escape route. Therein lies our actual attempt to be at all radical or at all political, is to say that even though we might be really policed, we can never actually be hemmed in. So the thing with 377, and certainly I'm glad that they have decriminalized same-sex desire, but the reason I was disappointed with the final judgment is because it, even in the name of expanding the ambit of legal desires or legal sexualities, what it did was it forced more desires and sexualities within the narrow frame of what it considers correct for the realm of the sexual. So, for instance, it said that it decriminalizes same sex desire in private. Now, we live in a country in which millions of people, tens of millions of people, for whatever reason, class, caste, age, occupation, do not have access to private rooms. And so this already seems like a judgment for the affluent few for whom this idea of privacy is even available. And so to think about desire as necessarily tied to privacy is one of the costs we have paid for accepting that judgment with jubilation. I think it's a huge cost to pay. I don't think it is a price we should have been asked to pay, and I don't think it's a price that should have been paid without some amount of resistance or without some amount of bargaining. And this is where I say the legal system or lawyers or judges take themselves so seriously that that they forget to actually think about the ramifications of the assumptions on which their utterances work or the utterances are based. So for me, that becomes then the paradox, because that's what you called it, which is that your most non-heteronormative desires, and some heterosexual ones too, are in fact not going to be found in private, right? They're going to be found in parks. As you know, in History of Desire, I have an entire chapter on parks. They're going to be found in metros. They're going to be found in car parks. They're going to be found in all the places that are the furthest thing from private, but that's because these desires do not find room and space, not just literally, but even imaginatively, in a certain kind of secluded space of intimacy. So, in fact, a further assumption that I find problematic is not just the access to a private room, but the further assumption is that sex should be private at all. And we forget, when we say that sex should be private, that this assertion is being made very publicly, right? It's the law that says it, it's your family that says it, it's your certain kind of tradition of your community that says it, that sexuality, desire should be kept behind closed doors, especially for women, of course, especially for non heterosexual men, so on and so forth. And so, this very public adjudication of desire as being private is a deeply problematic assertion. And again, that is one of the things, too, I think we need to push back against. But privacy to me is a very, very problematic concept. It is too tied up with a certain kind of capitalistic notion of individuality, individualism, a boundary, what people call sort of personal space. Again, those phrases are things I really don't like. I mean, has anyone traveled in a DTC bus and thought about personal space? It's just, it's unbelievably problematic. So all these assumptions are just swept under the carpet because there is a certain kind of elitist bias towards these judgments, and an elitist bias in all these laws, especially the laws of obscenity and sort of 377 and things like that. The bias is always in favor of a certain elite that can afford privacy.
And it's so interesting how you also brought up female desire when we are talking about not just privacy but desire overall. Because in feminist South Asian literature, we have often seen so many explorations of women wanting things beyond marriage and motherhood. So
Yeah,
I know this is a bit of we're taking a little bit of a detour from the law,
that's
but we
good.
have seen women talk about, wanting education, mobility, same sex love, or solitude.
Yeah.
These texts have often faced resistance precisely because they are depicting women as desiring subjects. What you said, the desire does not have to be for one thing only, it could also be desiring to do something.
Yeah.
So, what has been so threatening about female desire?
I mean, for that, you have to go back to, well, I'm going to use a very, very old example and then a very, very new example, I think. If you go back to the Bible, and you know there that what is forbidden to Adam and Eve is the fruit from the tree of knowledge. And the reason why Eve eats of that fruit or of that tree is because she said, "Why should knowledge be denied to me?" And the Bible is actually a more complicated text than just this. It's not that straightforward a story, but this narrative has been in Genesis has been read over and over again to say women are disobedient, knowledge is dangerous, and therefore knowledge also breeds disobedience. And women are associated with all these three phases that have gone on in Eve's eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so we have a long history of actually thinking about education and knowledge as breeding a certain kind of disobedience, as breeding a certain kind of questioning of the status quo. I mean, even as recently as a decade ago, a lot of people in Haryana. There was a story about this, where, as you know, Ashoka University's located, of patriarchs saying, no, no, we're not going to send our daughters to college because then they start eating, and this was what was so hilariously shocking, they start eating Chinese food and wearing jeans, and then they go all haywire, right? So, whether as an institution or as a field, education has always given rise to suspicions, especially in relation to women, which is also tied up with all that we've been talking about sex needing to be private, and especially for women, so on and so forth. You can't go out into the public world. So actually setting foot outside the house, going and listening to things, going and speaking, hearing one's own voice out in public is a very dangerous thing to do. And Kuhu, you probably heard me talk about this at Ashoka as well. I say this every time. Even students studying, say, at as excellent a university at Ashoka, students, most of whom have had many, many advantages in life, the women are still nervous about speaking in public. So, this idea of even privileged women being subject to the same suspicion of women in public it shows you the deep rootedness of the malaise. How this is a real problem that has been around for a long time. The new example that I want to use, and I don't know whether you've read this, Arundhati Roy's memoir, Mother Mary Comes to Me, which I think is absolutely brilliant. But one of the criticisms it has garnered is, oh my God, I'm sure, how can mothers be like this? A mother cannot be like that. And, how can she write about a mother this way? Mother can't be so evil, this, that, and the other, which I find annoying on several fronts. But I'll just talk about one, which is that such a criticism refuses to grant complexity to a woman just because she is a mother. And motherhood, of course, is one of those famous traps for women because it is told to women that this is your highest goal, this is your highest orientation, this is your highest desire. And then you get trapped in it because then you have to be the ideal mother. If you're anything less than that, then you get sort of criticized. And then if someone else brings that out, then that person gets criticized. So it's this whole vicious cycle in which women get trapped. And the beauty of Arundhati Roy's mother in that book, of Mary Roy's characterization, is that despite being a mother, she's also her own person. And she is her own person, especially in relation to the school she sets up. And she sets up a school, and her relationship to her students, according to her daughter and her son, is very different from her relationship to her daughter and her son because she's much more, according to them, nurturing and so on and so forth. Because clearly, here is a strong woman who recognizes the fact that especially women, but students, need an education. And they need to be made fearless because our entire lives we have been taught wonderfully how to be fearful. That is the one thing that every woman has succeeded in learning throughout our lives. And so her relation to her school, her relation to education, to come back to your question, Kuhu, is very much a sort of move that takes us in the direction of what is needed for women in the face of a long, long history in which knowledge, disobedience, and women form a sort of unholy triangle that we've all been buried under.
And if we're talking specifically about either roles that we are having to play as women or identities that could sort of restrict the way in which we are showing up, I think it would be remiss for us not to talk about caste. And caste is operating in such insidious ways also when it comes to desire, right? We have a Dalit woman whose desires are always already marked as available, exploitable. And then, for example, the Brahmin woman whose desires have to be pure, controlled. These are also very specific stereotypes that we are seeing propagated. And how is then caste creating different economies of want for women, but for us overall as well? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, everything we have been talking about in many ways circles around the blight of caste. I mean, the entire idea of privacy, for instance, the entire idea of privacy is linked irredeemably to the notion of purity and pollution, right? So you need something to be private because the private space is clean. I mean, Indians are so famously dirty outdoors because we feel the public place is the place of dirt and the private space is the space of cleanliness or cleanness. And the minute you're talking about dirt, cleanliness, purity, pollution, you are within the parameters of caste, and there is no getting away from it. And so, all this conversation that we've been having is very much tinged by the casteist notion of what can be touched, what should be touched, and what is, to borrow that term, untouchable. Because, as you yourself pointed out, even if a Dalit woman is termed untouchable in terms of her caste, she certainly appears to be very touchable when it comes to rape by upper caste men, right? So the notion of untouchability itself is very portable, it's very mobile and very malleable. So caste becomes one of those ways in which, one of those narratives in which people are trapped in many different ways. I don't even think we can even begin to plumb the depths of that entrapment. So we get trapped in that space of caste, and it affects everything. And I think the way it affects desire and sexuality is particularly both explicit and, to use your word, insidious. That everything about us, from the skin color, from this notion of privacy, from this notion of who lives where, what one's profession is. All this is very much imbued with caste, and there's no getting away from it, which is the big social marker in our country of how desire plays out.
Thank you so much, Professor Menon. And I'm also, again, thinking a lot about these sort of roles that you have said that often women are either not to, maybe the word is correct, typecast in. And I'm also now going to switch a little bit to thinking about literary desire, because I have a question about something very specific. You spoke about this role of a mother. For example, when a woman inhabits it, that is the only role that she can play. And
Right.
I'm also then thinking about the figure of the widow in South Asian literature. The widow who's not supposed to want anything, not food, not color, not pleasure, not sex. But literature keeps returning to the desiring widow. So, what work is that figure doing when we are talking about these roles that women are often just inhabiting, and these one dimensional roles? How is that fitting in when we talk about the figure of the widow?
Yeah, I mean, as you yourself said, the widow in the subcontinent is meant to be a figure leached of desire. And that leeching quite explicitly comes in the form of her being mandated to wear white, right? So there is no color, there is no rus, there is no taste in her life. The reason why widows in literature you might find fascinating, and I do too, is precisely because literature is the arena in which a certain kind of reality can be captured. And let me just sort of hasten to add that when I say reality, I don't necessarily mean a real time description of what's going on. I don't mean sociological surveys. I don't mean anthropological descriptions. I mean that the reality of our lives is so complex that the only way in which they can be mirrored is in the literary form. And we've all heard of that phrase, truth is much stranger than fiction. And so when we pretend that literature is the enemy, which is why for centuries, whenever you've had a certain kind of sort of right wing propaganda, it's books that get burned more than anything else. When we say literature is the enemy for complicating things, we only say that because we want to pretend that life is actually uncomplicated, which it is not. And the reason why literature has the most immediate relation to life, even if it is not realistic fiction, or it could be magical realism, which is one of the things that third world countries or authors from third world countries actually gravitate towards, because it more fully maps the fugitive desires that we've been describing so far. But there is a way in which literature allows for a complexity that no other subject does, or that no other document does. Whether it's a policy document or a sociological document or a political manifesto, it doesn't allow for the kind of complexity that only literature can mirror. Which is why the widows in literature are able explicitly to inhabit spaces that they are explicitly denied in life. But as we've been saying throughout, just because they're explicitly denied those spaces does not mean they don't occupy them or inhabit them or desire them. And literature becomes the realm in which that occupation, that inhabitation, that desirousness can in fact be brought to life.
Thank you, Professor Menon. Since we are now talking about literature so deeply, I will want to move on to one of my favorite works that you have sort of authored and edited, Shakespeare, which is the queer companion to the complete works of Shakespeare. And here is what interests me about that. You said you've grown up reading Shakespeare in India, where he was part of the colonial curriculum. I mean, we all have.
Yeah.
And how does reading Renaissance desire from a post colonial location change what you see? How is that informing how you are now reading South Asian texts?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question. Maybe I'll begin by thinking about Infinite Variety, A History of Desire in India, because when my editor first approached me to write that book, my first response was no, because I'm not a scholar of India. I'm not a scholar of Indian texts. I had never studied Indian literature. Anything I'd read was off my own accord. I'd never studied Indian philosophy or religions or anything of the kind. And so I said, I can't write about a history of desire in India because I am not a scholar in that realm at all. But of course, I forget that I always write about the things that I know nothing about. So that's why, a book about law, the book about Sufism now, because ideas fascinate me precisely when I haven't necessarily been trained in a legalistic manner about it or in relation to it. So the way in which I found my way into writing that book was to organize it entirely on the basis of ideas and ideas that come from my position. So, if anyone were to ask me what I thought of myself as intellectually and politically, my answer is always I think of myself as a queer theorist, right? That's what I am. And so, for me, the way into the book about a history of desire in India was to think about the ideas that queer theory is fascinated by and find landing points for them in the long durée histories of literature, philosophy, religions on the Indic subcontinent. So for me, I don't necessarily start with the fact of location. With me, I have always, which is why, of course, I could even study Shakespeare or could even be as interested in Shakespeare as I was. Not because I was located in England, not because I was made to read all of them, but precisely because there were some ideas that, to my mind, were excavated in really interesting ways in Shakespearean texts. And so when I came to writing a history of desire in India, there were excavations of ideas that I found fascinating here that I had not encountered before. Just to sort of give you a really basic example, I have, as you know, a chapter on hair and makeup. And the basic question for that I started out with for that chapter was, in today's world, gender seems very much determined by the length of one's hair, by one's availing of or access to makeup, by one's use of jewelry. And so it's very easy to see if you look around a crowd of however many, sure there might be one or two exceptions, but on the whole, anywhere you go in the world, it's going to break down into these categories. So what do you do then with texts and cultures and ideas in which hair and makeup and jewelry were not the distinguishing features between genders? What do you do in cultural traditions in which men also have long hair, wear makeup, and jewelry? What do you do with a text like the Kama Sutra, in which not only is the man supposed to be an expert in his own makeup, he is supposed to redo or touch up his girlfriend's makeup after she's got wet in the rain? So suddenly, gender cannot be disambiguated on the strength of the length of one's hair. What does that do to how we think about gender? What does that do to how we think about sexuality? So my approach has always been from the side of ideas. This is not to say, though, that ideas come in a vacuum or exist in a vacuum or are so rarefied and abstract that they just fall fully formed from the heavens. But equally, I would like to say that I have never been comfortable in situating my ideas or the ideas in which I'm interested as belonging completely or fully anywhere. because certainly I grew up in India and was educated here, but I was reading a lot of so-called Western literature. My language of comfort was English, no matter what other languages I spoke as well. And so this hasty distinction between East and West is not something that I think is particularly helpful, and certainly not for me when I think about ideas. So when you ask me about how I'm able to recast, let's say, Shakespearean ideas with a post-colonial lens, for me, that distinction is not so clear. What is clear to me, ironically, is the muddle around these questions of desire. And I want to take that muddle seriously. I actually think chaos is very, very important. And instead of distinguishing them between black and white, east and west, which, frankly forms the basis for right wing politics in our world today, I'm much more invested politically and intellectually in living with that chaos, that confusion, that boundary confusion that I don't want to sort out.
It's interesting that you bring up the East and West. I know it's something we spent a lot of time discussing when we were at Ashoka University, because these are stories, right? And stories often are transcending borders. Ideas, like you said, are
Right.
transcending borders. And so it becomes really interesting to then look at it from the lens of how is it that we can position these ideas in our context, as opposed to these ideas perhaps might not be necessarily
Right.
something that might emerge for us anyway. It's very
Right.
interesting when you put it that way. And you already spoke about infinite variety. So maybe to ask a little bit more around that,
Yeah.
infinite variety really is showing how desire in India has never been exclusively heterosexual. And you call yourself also, like you mentioned, a queer theorist.
Yeah.
Within that book, you write about Bhakti poetry, where Krishna and Radha transcend gender. You've written about androgynous gods and about same sex intimacies. But something that really stays with me is you also show how these weren't necessarily queer in the contemporary activist sense. They weren't necessarily organized around identity or rights. So,
Yeah.
what do we make of that disjuncture?
Yeah, I mean, the only sort of way in which I'd rephrase your excellent question is, it's not that I don't think of themselves as queer, as them those desires as queer, but I certainly don't think of them as identitarian. In fact, I do think of them as queer, because queerness is precisely that which really can't be defined. It does not have a label or a name. And so again, when we were talking about the 377 judgment, and I said we paid too high a price for that, I think having names, categories, definitions, are very high prices, very high costs to pay for desire. And what fascinates me about all the material that I unearthed for this book, and really material from our everyday lives, is that we have grown up, we continue to live in the midst of desires that have never been named. We all have those sort of bachelor uncles with their male best friends, or the spinster aunts with their female best friends with whom they go on holiday. We all have parents who would much rather allow boys to travel together than a boy and a girl, or girls to travel together than a girl and a boy. So we live in the midst of this kind of tumultuousness that I was talking about. The trouble with naming as, let's say, lesbian, gay, trans, intersex, the entire sort of gamut of the acronym that we use, is that you're not allowing for leaks. You're not allowing for leaks between categories, and you're not allowing for leaks outside categories. Actually, my favorite part of that acronym LGBTQIA plus is that word plus. It's not a word, the symbol plus, precisely because it's a symbol of defeat. That I can't, in fact, encompass all desires in an acronym, but it's also a symbol of victory, which is I am victorious precisely because I cannot contain everything within this acronym. And I want us to stay with that, again, to go back, Kuhoo, to what you were talking about, that paradox of the sort of victory as defeat and defeat as victory, the sense of I don't know, and that might be what is most exciting of all. I have actually never understood why knowledge in this sense, right? Knowledge in this sense is about answers rather than questions. Knowledge in the sense that Eve hankered after was the knowledge to ask questions. But knowledge in the sense of here is who you are. is something that I consider dangerous. I don't think anyone should tell anyone what they are. And B, mostly because everyone should have the freedom to be different things should they want to move from the L to the T or the I to the G at certain points, right? And we all know, of course, that that intersex babies who are born are automatically put between to the M or the F before they leave the hospital. So these are things that happen all the time. And we need to be able to take those seriously rather than just saying, oh my God, you don't have a label for this. That must mean you are backward or repressed or conservative or whatever, all the terms that we use to dismiss people or entire civilizations. So that for me was a big eye opener that the desires we're talking about are open, are in your face, are not imbued with the kind of shame that we drench desire in these days. And despite all that, or perhaps because of all that, they don't name themselves. So when you go to Khajuraho, you're not going to have the gay male section, or the lesbian section, or the intersex section, or the bestial section, right? You're going to have these scattered all around. If you read any of the Sufi poets, if you read Bulle Shah, he says, "Well, today I'm Heer, tomorrow I'll be Ranjha, or today I'm Soni, tomorrow I'll be Mahiwal," without saying, oh my God, I am a man who is becoming a woman, or I am a woman who is becoming a man. There is a certain kind of discomfort with boundary delineation. That is the absolute opposite of the kind of acronyms within which we live our lives these days. And for me, that is just much more fun, frankly, much more sort of, to use the word I've used before, chaotically fun, and therefore truer to the ambit of desire, truer to the remit of desire.
And it's so interesting that you talk about boundary delineation here, because I'm also thinking a little bit about the boundaries that we are crossing when we are thinking about sacred and profane divide. Because you've explored the erotics of devotion, right? How
Yeah,
spiritual yearning in Bhakti poetry or Sufi mysticism uses the language of erotic desire. So,
that's
what
right.
is happening when we read devotional literature as
Yeah.
also about bodily desire?
Yeah, and in fact, the idea that religion and eroticism are different from one another is a relatively new idea. And it's certainly sort of much more of a post-biblical idea than anything else. Um, because there's no question. I mean, regularly, Sufi poets used to perform on the steps of the Jama Masjid. Regularly, bhakti poetry is about gods and how what to do with their bodies, how to crush. Krishna talks about how to crush Radha's breasts. Radha talks about how dig her nails deep into Krishna's body. Bulle Shah will talk about Shah Inayat, his peer and God in the same breath. Khusro will speak about his peer Nizamuddin and God in the same breath. So all these, the Sufi poets, the Bhakti poets, all these people give us an absolute lack of boundary between what we call the sacred and the profane, or the spiritual and the erotic, or the sort of religious and the material. And the reason why the reason why they refuse that boundary is because you cannot separate the one from the two. So just to speak about Sufi poetry for a moment, the beautiful boy in front of the male poet is always the shahid or the witness of God's beauty. Now, you can't separate God out from this beauty because God you cannot see, you can only see the human beloved. But you can't separate the human beloved out because the human beloved is pointing in the direction of God's beauty. So, desire for Sufi poets always has to be at least dual, that there is going to be the human beloved in front of you, and there's going to be the beloved as God, who is not in front of you, but who is always evoked by the human beloved. So that idea of saying, oh my God, my erotic desire is here and my religious desire is there, simply does not make sense from a spiritual point of view as well. So this new distinction, I was just actually saying this earlier today. A friend of mine once made a suggestion about what would happen if the place assigned today to religion and to sex were to be reversed. So these days, religion is meant to be out there in the world, meant to be public, to be shouted from the rooftops, and desire, sexuality is meant to be private. What happens in a thought experiment if we were to live in a world in which sexuality was meant to be public and religion was meant to be private, right? What would happen if we lived in a world in which the Kama Sutra or the Sufis were the most public of all, and sort of the law or religion was private? Um, First of all, the Sufis would not even recognize that distinction because, like, how can you separate out religion from this? But I'm talking from our perspective today. It's a really interesting thought experiment, but it's a thought experiment that would not make sense to Amir Khusro, for instance, because he never separated the two out to begin with.
No, it's very interesting that you bring that up, because I also know in your work at the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka, you're
Yeah,
committed to what you call non-identitarian politics that
yeah,
takes seriously the desires and fantasies that undergird our daily lives. And when you're talking about specifically, for example, sexuality being
yeah,
public, what we talk about at the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality is quite different from identity based activism, right? So,
right.
what becomes possible when we are organizing around desire, perhaps, rather
Yeah.
than identity?
Yeah, yeah. And that's an excellent question, and you're absolutely right. It is what we're trying to do, even though it's an uphill task because people, we get rewarded for being identitarian, right? People get rewarded for occupying positions of identity. So it's very hard to sort of say, well, please don't go there because who does not want a reward? But and this is something that Foucault is so brilliant at theorizing, that there is no thing such thing as a free lunch, right? That the minute you accept this reward, you also fall into a pit of control. And the minute and Foucault, of course, famously says visibility is a trap, because the minute you're seen, you can also be policed. And it's if you're not seeing, if you refuse identification, if you refuse classification, that's the only time in which you can actually explore, in which you can actually sort of jump across the border, in which you can actually travel without a visa, intellectually or desirously speaking. And that's what we're interested in, right? Which goes back to what I was saying earlier. We're not particularly interested in saying we are Eastern or we're Western. We're interested in saying what is it about desire that might actually allow us to travel across all this. So, in fact, one of the things one of the projects that we're in the process of putting together now is an anthology called Transnational Transgender, which is also the title of a seminar that I've taught a couple of times, precisely because I'm rather annoyed by how this entire discourse around transness has been taken over by a certain kind of Anglo-American academic expression, as though transness was invented there, right? Whereas there are such rich histories of transness around the world, just waiting to be mined. And we're hoping in this anthology to put together lots of primary texts, but lots of theory and criticism as well, that show you how wide this world is without really being restricted to labels and identificatory categories. And the world is wide only if you get out of those labels and identificatory categories. Because the minute you occupy them, you are speaking the language that has emanated from somewhere. The language of even transness, the language of LGBTQIA plus, comes from a certain point, comes from a certain perspective. But it's also a perspective that disallows many others. What happens if, on the other hand, you come from a point that actually is fluid about its location, that actually is able to take on board more than one perspective? For me, that's what's more interesting um, about coming at life from the perspective of desire rather than identity.
Thank you so much, Professor Menon. I think it's been so interesting to be able to journey through these different questions, these different ways in which desire shows up with you. I'm always left with so many thoughts every time I have a conversation with you. But before we end, I would like to also maybe ask a little bit about reading practices, because there are listeners who might want to become more attuned to desire in the text that they are reading, including texts that might not necessarily seem to be about desire at all. And
Right.
given your extensive work around desire and sexuality, what do you think they should be looking for when they are reading?
So this is why I was drawn to the Sanskaari Girls, right, book club, which is that it's about reading, it's about being ironic about the location you're expected to occupy, and it's about resisting that. You're not going to find desire if you look for it, which is why I'm always skeptical of people who say, oh, this is the great gay classic of the year, or this is the great women's text of the year. Because if you already know that before you're reading it, then there's nothing in the text for you. For me, the great challenge and beauty of literature always is to read for what you don't know. We are falling alarmingly into the pattern of people wanting to read for themselves, and if they don't see themselves reflected in a text, then they don't want to read it. And my argument has always been you don't read in order to see yourself reflected, you read in order to travel. And it is during your travels that you figure out who you might or might not be. So if there is a coherent self that predates the reading practice, then you're not actually reading. But if there is a fragmented, fractured, volatile, unput downable, flighty set of ideas, desires, wishes that approaches a text, that's what it means to read. So that's the position from which you need to come in order to be a reader. Desire, as I said at the very beginning, is everywhere. I don't think you can read a single text without finding something about desire in it. What you find, why you find it, what you do with it is going to differ from person to person. But how you approach the text to me is much more key. If you're going to approach it as a fully formed, already informed reader, you're not going to get as much from the text as you would if you were much more open ended in your approach to it.
Thank you. And I find it so cool that you framed reading as almost traveling. And I'd love to ask, where have you been traveling lately? Are there particular South Asian writers or texts that you think are doing especially interesting work, or who should we be reading?
Right. Well, I mean, the Arundhati Roy book I just mentioned, which I certainly think everyone should read. I mean, she's a beautiful writer. The other book that I actually just finished a couple of days ago, a big book, it's about 700 pages, is the Kiran Desai novel that was shortlisted for the Booker, The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny. And I think I absolutely loved maybe 550 pages of it. And then the last 150 pages for me fell off a cliff a little bit, precisely because it didn't follow through on its own promise. I mean, but if you want, you have a wonderful, brilliant 550 pages to read. So I would encourage you to read it anyway. But what's brilliant about this 550 pages is because it really takes seriously that idea of the complexity of life in India. And when I mean in India, I don't only mean geographically in India, it's also Indians in America, so on and so forth. Sort of weaves together magical realism, social realism, all these things that people usually like to put in separate genres, and brings it together so beautifully. But then at the end, it sort of almost becomes like the lawyers I was telling you about, right? It starts taking itself too seriously, and that's when you lose that. You need a light touch in order to write brilliantly and to be a good reader as well. But I still think it's a brilliant book for the most part and absolutely mesmerizing. I could not put it down. So I would certainly recommend that. But I just finished that 2 days ago, and then I've been back to my Japanese detective novels for a bit. And so yes, absolutely, you can travel anywhere in the world by reading. And then sometimes, if you're lucky enough and if you manage to save up enough money and can get a visa, you can go to these places physically as well.
I love that. And it's definitely on my TBR. So for those 550 pages, I will take your word for it.
Yeah,
Big
it's
man.
really brilliant.
Yes. Yes. And I think my final question then is, you spoke a little bit about what you are working on, like about specifically the transnational transgender, but what are you currently most occupied by, and where is your thinking about desire taking you?
Well, I currently am sort of trying to finish this book whose title you mentioned, Love in the Moonlight, Sufism, Sexuality, Shakespeare. because I'm trying to sort of write about a conversation that has not taken place, even though it's shocking that it hasn't taken place, um, which is a conversation uh, between Shakespeare and the Sufis, organized around their ideas of sexuality, not because I think Shakespeare read the Sufis or that Shakespeare had access to Sufi literature, but precisely because Shakespeare does things in his poetry and plays, especially in his poetry, that are to be found nowhere other than in Sufi poetry. So here again, we've just been talking about the falsity, the false binary of East and West. That's one of the things that plays out in this book that I'm writing now. Because even though Sufi texts are considered foreign to Europe and not, and Shakespeare is considered sort of European, white European, what they call a sort of certain poetic revolution that took place in Europe around the 10th and 11th century. It's a revolution that actually comes from Al-Andalus, from Arabia, from Persia, from the ideas of Sufis. So again, I'm not making a historical argument that says Shakespeare read the Sufis, but I am making an argument based on ideas. From where did these ideas enter into this conversation? What might this conversation look like? And I think it is purely, I don't even know what to call it. It's inexplicable to me, other than a certain kind of narrow parochial Eurocentrism that has refused to look beyond its borders in order to think about where certain ideas might have come from. So, if we think about sexuality today, if we think about the boldness of sexual ideas today, they actually are to be found in Sufi poetry rather than any modern, liberatory, liberated poetry that we think we're producing today.
Thank you so much, Professor Menon. I'm very excited to read it when it comes out and for some of these
Thank you.
conversations to continue. I think you are such an anchor to us when we have these conversations. And so I'm really excited to read all of these ideas and hopefully be able to discuss them with you as well.
Thank
And
you.
thank you for this rich conversation and for helping us think differently about wanting, desire, sexuality, and really for showing us how literature can be a space where desire doesn't have to apologize for itself. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kuhoo. Thank you for your stimulating questions. And thank you for being such a Sanskari ladki.
Thank you so much. And very quickly, for our listeners, we will include information about Professor Menon's books. Both Infinite Variety and The Law of Desire are both published by Speaking Tiger Books.
That's
So
right.
that is in our show notes, along with resources from the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka
Great.
University. I will say, please dive into them. They are very, very good resources that we have really drawn from. So, again, thank you so much for all that you do. Uh,
Thank you.
this has been the Sanskaari Girls Podcast. I'm Kuhoo, and please do follow us on Instagram at Sanskaari Girls Book Club. Sign up for membership, which is currently free. You can join a growing club of 900 plus members and subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated for all things Sanskaari. Very quick shout out to Anjali for production and scripting, and Vandita for the overall support. Keep reading, keep writing, and keep finding new ways to make your voice heard through the